Good afternoon. Welcome back to UCSF Medicine Grand Rounds. I'm Bob Wachter, chair of the UCSF Department of Medicine. Welcome, as usual, to our live audience from our department, from our other colleagues at UCSF and the UCSF Health Network. As is our practice, we will post this video about 7:30 p.m. tonight on YouTube, and I'll tweet a summary as well as the web address when that is ready. Our previous Grand Rounds in the series have now received about 1 million views. A few quick ground rules are up here. You'll be on mute. If you have questions, submit them through the Q&A where my colleague Quinny Chang is monitoring them. We will try to get to as many of them as we can. As we hit the 6-month mark of living with COVID in the United States, there's little hope of getting back to our prior lives without the development of a safe and effective vaccine. As we have come to learn, as hard as the science is, the manufacturing, distribution, and uptake of vaccines may turn out to be just as crucial and as complex as the science. And the fact that that vaccine development process has landed squarely in the middle of a dizzying presidential campaign in which a major subtext is the role of science and, in fact, the role of facts, simply adds to the stakes and to the drama. It seems like just about every day brings up a you couldn't make this up moment. And just to add another twist, this is more than just a US story. Vaccines are being developed by many countries and ultimately will need to be given to people in every country in the world. So it raises other issues of diplomacy and of equity on top of the myriad other issues that we're grappling with. So one could clearly fill several books in discussing the various angles here, but we'll try to do the best we can in about 75 minutes. Luckily, we have 3 world experts to help us try to make sense of all this. The first is Professor Peter Hotez, who's the founding dean at the National School of Tropical Medicine and professor in the departments of Pediatrics, Molecular Virology, and Microbiology at the Baylor College of Medicine. Peter serves as co-director of the Texas Children's Hospital Center for Vaccine Development and health policy scholar at the Center for Medical Ethics and Health Policy at Baylor College. I'm going to stop with your titles, Peter, or else it will take up all your time. Unless you have sworn off television, which would not be an unreasonable thing to do, you probably have seen Peter's thoughtful discussions of vaccine science and politics on many different networks over the past several weeks. His latest book is called Preventing the Next Pandemic, Vaccine Diplomacy in a Time of Anti-Science, and he'll be speaking about these issues of both the science and policy aspects of vaccine with us today. Peter, thank you for being with us. After Peter, we'll hear from our own Jaime Sepulveda, who's the Haile T. DeBoss Distinguished Professor of Global Health and the Executive Director of the UCSF Institute of Global Health Sciences. Prior to his arrival at UCSF, Jaime served on the executive team of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, formulating policy for that extraordinarily influential foundation. He also served as the director of Mexico's National Institute of Health. Jaime will talk about issues of international vaccine distribution and health equity. And I also want to thank Jaime and the Institute for Global Health Sciences, which is co-sponsoring this session today along with our department. So Jaime, thank you. Finally, we're privileged to have Professor Heidi Larson come with us from the United Kingdom, where it is very late in the evening. So thank you, Heidi, for being with us. Heidi is the director of the Vaccine Confidence Project and professor of Anthropology, Risk and Decision Science in the Department of Infectious Disease Epidemiology at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. She is one of the world's foremost experts on the social and political factors that can affect uptake of health interventions and influence policies, and she has a particular focus on those issues as they relate to vaccines. As we move from the science of vaccine development to the art of getting people to take them, it's hard to think of a more important issue or one that's under greater assault in today's political and cultural environment. So Heidi, we're thrilled that you could be with us as well. So as you see, 3 extraordinary speakers to try to cover the waterfront as we think about getting to effective and safe vaccines and getting people to take them. Really amazing time that we find ourselves in. So let us start with the way we're going to structure this is Peter's going to speak to us for about 25 minutes. I'll do a brief Q&A with him, and then we'll bring on both with Jaime and Heidi to speak about their issues, and then we'll have a panel discussion involving all 4 of us for the rest of the session. So with that, let me turn the controls over to Peter, and look forward to hearing your comments.
It's an honor to be able to be here. UCSF has been a source of inspiration for my whole medical and scientific career. We've always looked to the Department of Medicine at UCSF for cutting edge science and medicine. And so I really appreciate that opportunity. And it's really fun for me to be with two of my global health heroes, Professor Larson and Professor Sepulveda. I'm going to give kind of a lightning 20-minute, as was mentioned, 30,000-foot aerial view of the landscape of COVID-19 vaccines from a unique perspective, because we're developing our own vaccine, and you'll see some other unique elements to it, and then we'll do a little bit of Q&A. I want to start here, which is just a brief reminder of the extraordinary power of vaccines. These are enumerations from the Global Burden of Disease study from the Institute of Health Metrics that looked at how we've progressed at vaccinating the world's children, a lot of it through the activities of the Gavi Alliance, the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunization. There's the old logo and the new logo that was launched with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation support of $750 million in 2000. And you can see the extraordinary impact in terms of reducing the number of children who die every year over the 17-year period. And this is the last date that the Institute for Health Metrics has put up. They're coming up with 2019 data pretty soon, but you get the idea. Huge impact in terms of reductions in deaths in measles, pertussis, tetanus, Haemophilus influenza, type B diphtheria. Just to the right, I'm including some black and white images from Sebastião Salgado, who's a famous photographer who has spent time going around the world photographing children getting their vaccines. And I have one of those images in my new book. And I love them because of the expression of the parents' faces, the full range of human emotion from hope to joy to fear. It's a very moving set of images. But in the book, and that's pictured on the lower right, that'll come out soon, I tried to make the case that all of those global health gains, while they're still important, certainly in making a huge impact, we're starting to see the beginnings of what I think is an erosion, a slowing, and in some cases even a halting of some of those gains. And I make the point that it started even before COVID-19, so that COVID-19 is a culminating event, but we're starting to see that unraveling happening earlier. And in the book, I identify some important parts of the world, like the Arabian Peninsula and what Jeffrey Gettleman calls Africa's unwars, referring to the armed banditry on civilian populations rather than wars as we know them, what's going on in Venezuela, Central Latin America. And I even make the case of that Texas and the Gulf Coast is not immune. And it makes the point that we're seeing these erosions for things that we ordinarily don't think about as physicians and scientists. Big social, I know Heidi does, Dr. Professor Larson does, but not many of the of us generally think about things like political instability or wars or climate change or urbanization, deforestation, and this rise of anti-science. And I know now in the lexicon there's a lot of talk about climate change, and I make the point, yes, climate change is important, but it's operating not in isolation, but in combination with these other forces, combining in unique and interesting, but often horrifying ways to bring back disease. And still another force with that is the shifting nature of poverty, which I call blue marble health, to give it a distinct term from global health. And it's an idea that, for full disclosure, is not really caught on much. I think it's going to be important, but it's not widely accepted. But the idea, and this was also a subject of an earlier book, to say that when we added up the number of people living with poverty-related diseases such as leishmaniasis or you name it, leprosy or dengue or tuberculosis, parasitic worm infections, overwhelmingly they're in the group of 20 countries. And you might say that doesn't make any sense. The group of 20 countries represents the world's largest economies, but it's the poor living among the wealthy, or what I sometimes call the poorest of the rich, that seem to account for these illnesses overwhelmingly. And I call it blue marble health to kind of help us think a different way of our usual norms of global health, poor countries versus rich countries, to say that all countries have poverty-related diseases, including the G20, but it's the poor living among the wealthy. And in many respects, COVID-19 is going by that playbook. This is a new free update you can download from Johns Hopkins University Press Project Muse. I did a COVID-19 update to Blue Marble Health, which you can download for free now, and it's called Poverty and the Impact of COVID-19. And if you look at the world's 30 million cases, million deaths from COVID-19, overwhelmingly they're in G20 countries, European countries, but also the United States, Brazil, India, Russia, South Africa, Mexico, and Saudi Arabia. And although we don't ordinarily think of COVID-19 as a health disparity, in fact, when you look at a lot of the numbers, that's how it's playing out. It's the poor living among the wealthy in that blue marble health approach. I don't have time to go into too much detail, but let me give you what I think is a kind of a chilling example. In Houston, Texas, where I live and work at the Texas Medical Center, every day the Houston Health Department puts out information on the people who've perished in our COVID-19 epidemic. And they don't list it by name, but they list it by sex, age, and race or ethnicity. And this is a typical day. And you read down the list: Hispanic, 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 Black, Black, Hispanic, Hispanic, Hispanic. This illness is causing what I call historic decimation of Hispanic communities across our southern states, particularly in the metro areas like in Houston and San Antonio and Dallas, but also, of course, in Arizona and Florida and Louisiana, and certainly in South Texas. And it's especially among the essential workers, those who can't make a living via Skype and Zoom or remotely. They are working on construction sites or in family-owned businesses such as dry cleaners or, you name it, restaurants, bakeries, and this piece of the COVID-19 epidemic, you can find it if you scratch the surface, but it's not immediately obvious, and it's not something that you're hearing about a lot. But it's one of the reasons that if you've ever heard me on TV in the last few weeks, you've noticed there's been sort of an edge in my voice, and I have taken a more political tone than I ever have previously. And it's deliberate because I've been so upset about what I'm seeing to these African-American and Hispanic and Native American communities. And it's going on without a lot of attention. Now, in terms of vaccines, I like to make the point that making a COVID-19 vaccine is actually not as hard as you think. In some ways, it's an old school problem in virology. You need to induce a strong immune response against the spike protein of the virus. And by now, everyone has seen the cartoons of the COVID-19 virus, the SARS coronavirus 2, with these trimeric spikes that allowed it to bind to its host angiotensin converting enzyme receptor, which in itself is a carboxypeptidase. And then there's uptake. And this is a slide from Tony Fauci, who gave a lecture at the National Academies a couple of months ago. And I took it because he mentioned our Baylor vaccine, so I couldn't resist. But the point is, if you look at, people are often confused, why all the technologies, the mRNA approach or DNA or adenovirus or live attenuator, recombinant protein or nanoparticle, and I would add to that inactivated virus, and make the point that these are multiple different approaches to more or less achieve the same end, to get high virus neutralizing antibody titers and some T cell responses, maybe some CD8 positive responses. And that's how you'll get a COVID-19 vaccine. And there's some disagreement in the scientific community about the best approach. We think it's a recombinant protein approach. The Oxford AstraZeneca group feels the adenovirus approach is the way to go, and the Moderna and Pfizer, the mRNA, but it's essentially all working on the same principle. And in the US, of course, our program is called Operation Warp Speed, which we're not part of. This is mainly focused around the pharma companies, and you're seeing two major waves of Operation Warp Speed vaccines. The first one that we're getting phase 3 trial data probably soon, we hope, maybe in November, December, looks at the two mRNA vaccines from Moderna and Pfizer, and then the AstraZeneca Oxford vaccine, the adenovirus technology, and then you'll see, and some of these later platforms will come with that second wave. Novavax actually is in phase 3 trials in South Africa and elsewhere with an exciting protein particle vaccine. J&J has an adenovirus vaccine. Sanofi has a different type of recombinant protein. And Merck & Company has a very interesting live vesicular stomatitis virus vaccine similar to the Ebola vaccine that was used in the Democratic Republic of Congo last year. And the idea behind the speed, this is a public-private partnership between the pharma companies and the US government, is not so much to rush the clinical trials as many think, but in fact that's not being done. What's being done is to build factories now before we know whether the vaccines work or not, combine some of the phases, and that's where the warp speed part comes in. Now, there are a lot of advantages of this approach. I'm an enthusiastic champion of it. It has an accelerated timetable. I like the innovation factor, a diverse array of technologies, the idea of getting multiple shots on goal, which in itself is a way to do this. Manufacturing at risk, if you're not constrained by resources, you can do that, meaning you can manufacture these whether you know whether they work or not, with a high expectation that's going to protect the American people. Now, there are some potential disadvantages. One is those first three vaccines use technology that have never been licensed before for a human vaccine. So in that sense, I sometimes use the term shiny new toys. I mean, a very heavy emphasis on innovation, which is great, but I sometimes think it's done at the expense of some of the old school vaccine technologies like inactivated viruses or a recombinant protein produced through fermentation, which we know have a track record of working. Also, they're expensive. The one thing I've been very outspoken on criticizing Operation Warp Speed about is their absence of a communication plan or strategy. So what they've been doing is allowing the companies to be in the lead. And I feel this is not working well, and maybe we can talk about that at the discussion. It's very tone deaf to a very aggressive anti-vaccine movement. My other issue is it's the very much U.S. go it alone strategy. We're not seeing a level of U.S. leadership around global governance for health. In fact, there's even this new term out there, which I absolutely hate, called vaccinationalism, where people talk about the British vaccine or the American vaccine or the Chinese vaccine or the Russian vaccine. It was never supposed to work that way. I mean, history tells us that success in global access for vaccines depends on international cooperation, what I like to call vaccine diplomacy. And the poster child for that, I like to say, is what Albert Sabin did in the 1950s, when after the Sputnik launch in 1957, he got back channel permission to collaborate with his Soviet counterparts. And that's where he brought his virus strains to the USSR. It was scaled up in the vaccine for the first time for humans in the Soviet Union, tested on 10 million Soviet school children, shown to be safe and effective. And that's what led to ultimately to the licensure of the polio vaccine. There was similar US-American cooperation for the smallpox vaccine. The Russians are very good at freeze-dry technology. They figured out how to freeze-dry the smallpox vaccine, create dry vax, and that helped us eradicate smallpox. But we're missing that right now. The other piece to this is I'm quite worried about low and middle income countries, especially the big urban areas. We're hearing in Guayaquil, Ecuador, in Ecuador and Latin America, of corpses piling in the streets. And this is not alone. We're seeing really aggressive, horrible epidemics in Belém and Fortaleza and Manaus in northern Brazil. And I'm quite worried about the big cities, mega cities in India or Lagos in Nigeria. I mean, if you just look at these pictures and you can see right away, how do you do social distancing under these kinds of conditions? You can't, and we're going to need vaccine, but I'm concerned that there is not enough global attention that's being paid right now to figuring out those great Operation Warp Speed vaccines. What do we do for the rest of the world? Now, getting less attention, there is this alternative path that I think is being somewhat successful, and it's a group of vaccine manufacturers who actually brand themselves as the developing country vaccine manufacturers network. And it doesn't get the attention in the Western press, at least on the US side, like the Operation Warp Speed vaccines. But for instance, you're seeing Sinovac, which is a Chinese vaccine company, has an inactivated virus vaccine on alum, and they're partnering with Instituto Butantan in Sao Paulo to scale production. Or AstraZeneca Oxford is partnering with Fiocruz for an adenovirus-based vaccine, or Biopharma in Indonesia with the Chinese again with Sinovac for an activated virus. This is the Russian vaccine, and a lot of stuff going on in India with the Serum Institute partnering with AstraZeneca Oxford. Bharat Biotech is a pretty exciting inactivated virus vaccine. And we're collaborating now with PATH, the Program for Appropriate Technology for Health in Seattle, and Biological E for a recombinant protein vaccine in yeast. And while they're also partnering with J&J for an adenovirus vaccine. So our partnership, which is based at Texas Children's, we'll call it the Texas Children's Center for Vaccine Development at Baylor College of Medicine, is linked up with PATH, which is a very important global health organization, maybe not that well known. They're based in Seattle. They have a great history of working with the Gates Foundation to accelerate the meningococcal A vaccine for Africa, the malaria vaccine for Africa, and now they're partnering up with us for our global coronavirus vaccine. So our Texas Children's Center for Vaccine Development for the last 20 years has been working to accelerate low-cost global health vaccines. We're mainly focused on parasitic disease vaccines. We have vaccines for parasitic worm infections, for diseases like schistosomiasis in clinical trials, our Chagas disease vaccines going into the clinic in Mexico next year. And it's co-led by myself and my science partner for 20 years, Mary Elena Batazzi. And about a decade ago, we got approached by the New York Blood Center, Lan Yingdu and Shibu Jiang, because they had pioneered a pretty exciting approach to coronavirus vaccines for SARS-1 and that emerged out of South China in 2003, and for MERS, Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome. But they were concerned that they were having a hard time finding. At that time, nobody cared that much about coronavirus vaccines. And so we partnered with them to scale up their concept. And it was the following, that if you look at the coronavirus spike protein, here's a picture of the trimer. What they found is when they immunized laboratory animals and challenged them following immunization with the full spike protein, they produced a lot of immune enhancement, eosinophilic infiltrates in the lungs or in the liver. But if they pared it down just to the receptor binding domain, they got the high neutralizing antibodies and protection without the immune enhancement. And so we partnered with them on a SARS-1 vaccine. And when COVID-19 emerged, we thought, maybe we could repurpose the SARS-1 vaccine that we developed for SARS-2 as a heterologous vaccine. Everybody hated the idea. They just were not confident about that approach. So we moved very quickly, though, to make the receptor binding domain for SARS-2. And we do this expressing it in yeast, Pichia pastoris. Now you might, and this is a scanning EM of those green blobs there are budding yeast. Now you might say, well, who cares about yeast or Pichia pastoris? Well, the reason why it's relevant is that fermentation technology approach in yeast is used to make recombinant hepatitis B vaccine in many places. So Bangladesh makes its own hepatitis B vaccine in Brazil and Cuba and India and Indonesia. So if you're trying to make a global health vaccine, this is a good technology because you can transfer that technology. And now we've done this and we're scaling up to make 1 billion doses. And we're pretty excited about that because we've never made 1 billion for anything. So, and this is a picture of the SARS-1 receptor binding domain, SARS-2. You can see how superimposable they are. And we can show now that we can elicit high titers of pseudovirus neutralizing antibody. And now what we're doing is we've transferred this technology to BioE, Biological E in India, where they have that capacity to make 1 billion doses now going into clinical development. So we're really excited that this could provide some backings, some belts and suspenders for the fact that a lot of the other vaccines may not filter down to low-income countries. Finally, I'll finish up by saying the other big problem that we're facing, and I know Professor Larson will comment more about this, is the fact that there's been a lot of resistance to COVID-19 vaccines here in the US. We've had 2 major surveys from the Associated Press and Reuters, finding that up to half of Americans will refuse COVID-19 vaccines, even if they're made available. And a lot of it, again, is that lack of communications coming out of Operation Warp Speed, because what the anti-vaccine lobby alleges is vaccines are rushed, are not adequately tested for safety. There's conflicts of interest between the pharma companies and the US government, and they campaign around this banner of health freedom. And we've already seen since the 2016 election this pretty dramatic rise in the number of kids being denied access to vaccinations in Texas. So the anti-vaccine movement is heavily centered in Texas, especially in the Austin area, where it's linked to health freedom, and very much made this pivot in 2015 to the far right wing, to the far right fringe groups, and they get a lot of money from Tea Party organizations. And so there's this far right twist to vaccines that worry me. So we had done a lot of work, countering their initial claims that vaccines cause autism and other chronic illnesses. And I'm a pediatrician scientist, but I'm also the father of 4 adult kids, including Rachel, who has autism and intellectual disabilities, and wrote this book in 2018, which goes into depth into the science, explaining why there's no link between vaccines and autism, but also what autism is. And it goes into the fact that we now know that there's 100 genes that have been linked to autism, involved in early fetal brain development, or are expressed early in brain development in the fetus, well before kids ever see vaccines. They're expressed and enriched and early in excitatory and inhibitory neuronal lineages. And the full accounting of the genes was recently published in Cell by the group at the Broad Institute at Harvard, MIT, and the Stanley Center for Psychiatric Research. Well, one of the things that we did was did whole exome sequencing on Rachel and my wife and I, and we've identified a gene that very much resembles this cohort of neuronal cytoskeleton genes that were identified by the Institute at Harvard, MIT, and non-red cell spectrum and neuronal spectrum. And then this then gets into some side conversations about autism, because Rachel is female, of course, and we used to have this discussion that autism was 10 to 1 boys to girls, but that's because autism is so underdiagnosed in girls and women. Now we know it's much closer to 3 to 1, and some say 1.5 to 1. It's just that girls and women with autism can camouflage it better. They or often have comorbidities like obsessive compulsive disorders or eating disorders or anorexia, and that's what gets diagnosed, not the autism. But while doing all of this, we're still now seeing this globalization of the American-style anti-vaccine movement. And as Professor Larson this is from some of her work, she's done a great job looking at the geography or the epidemiology of vaccine hesitancy. And now what we're starting to see, though, is what was sort of confined and walled off in North America is expanding rapidly, and it's happening through 2 major ways. So this is a picture of RFK Jr., who's one of the leaders of the anti-vaccine movement in the United States, and he spoke in Berlin, Germany. That was sponsored by far right-wing groups that were very concerning in Germany. And now what we're seeing is the Russians are exploiting this and filling our social media and internet with a lot of anti-vaccine content. So there's this globalization of American anti-science that worries me. And now the World Health Organization has listed vaccine hesitancy as one of the top 10 global health threats. So this is my last slide to say that this is the picture of the new book. This is we're in a bit of an epic struggle, and that's how I view it. Is we're making great progress with vaccines and soon COVID-19 vaccines, but we're being opposed by a number of 21st century forces, poverty and climate change, war, political collapse, urbanization, and anti-science. And I'll make the point that when we talk about training physicians or physician scientists or residents or fellows, we don't ordinarily think of these things. But I make the plea that we have to start considering it, that we have to broaden our view and recognize that some of our biggest enemies in combating disease are some of these really important forces, and we need to bring in more social science as well as other aspects as well. And I'm sure Heidi will probably agree with that. So Professor Wachter, I'll stop there and proceed however you'd like.
Great. Thank you, Peter, so much. It was terrific and really wonderful broad approach to the problem. Let me sort of focus on a few questions that relate to some of the scientific issues and then a few of the political issues, and we'll save some of the other issues about vaccine hesitancy and equity issues for both Jaime and Heidi. If you're a betting man, what are the chances that we will have a vaccine that truly is safe and effective enough that it would be approved under normal circumstances, and we'll talk about today's circumstances, let's say by January 1st?
So if you're talking about the U.S., I assume, and
the U.S.
in terms of going through full licensure, that may be problematic, because I think we'll have, if these first tranche of vaccines, the 2 mRNA vaccines, and the adenovirus, the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, are shown to work and are safe, and we have that data by the end of the year, the traditional licensure process can take almost a year after that, and even through an expedited process, maybe 6 to 8 months. And the problem is the epidemic is so ferocious in the United States. We're down to 750 deaths a day, but we'll likely by then be back up to 1,000 deaths per day. Who wants to let another 180,000 people perish? So what do you do? So what are your options? And one of them is to be on expedited review, is to enroll individuals through expanded access programs and do it under informed consent. The other is to do an emergency use authorization for releasing the vaccine. The problem there is we've never done that for a major vaccine. We've done it once for a anthrax vaccine that was approved and used in the military, and there was a shift to use it for inhalational anthrax. It was already approved. We had to switch the indication, but this is very different. We've never really done an EUA for a full vaccine that would be given to a big segment of the American population. So nobody really knows what that means, and so there's a lot of hand-wringing and teleconferences and Zoom calls for the scientific community to figure that out. And of course, you've got the White House being very aggressive about trying to do this before the election. I don't see a path by which that happens. But even afterwards, how do you do this in a safe and equitable manner? And how do you do it with transparency, especially with the pharma companies in the lead, which has not been working well? So I think for it to work, one, I think Operation Warp Speed's got to take back the communications and lead the communications and find people that the American population will accept and trust. Then I think they have to, Moderna put out their protocols today. All the companies need to do that, but also making the phase 3 data available. I think the scientific community in an open access way has to see the data by which the EUA decision was made. I think that's going to be really important. Otherwise, if people like myself and you get on CNN or MSNBC and say, we don't know what the heck's going on, we haven't seen any of the data, that won't go well. And I think part of the problem is the pharma companies have underestimated how quickly things can derail, even if it's a good vaccine, right? We've seen that. We've seen the Lyme disease vaccine tank. We've seen one of the rotavirus vaccines tank, even though they were good vaccines. And we've seen a lot of rookie mistakes. For instance, AstraZeneca is not a vaccine company. And yet, you had the CEO, be recorded talking to JP Morgan investors about the fact that there were 2 pauses that the public didn't know about, and maybe the transverse myelitis. It was messaged in the worst possible way possible. Or Moderna, which is also not a vaccine company, we had all the stock trading and the conflicts of interest. This is not going well with the American people. And if they don't fix the communication, I think the science is going well. I think these trials have a lot of integrity. I can't stress that enough. But the messaging has been just awful. Or the non.
I wanted to ask you about the science. So sounds like you believe that within several months there actually will be a vaccine that, forgetting about how it gets approved and how it's perceived.
I think there'll be multiple.
Does work.
Yeah, I think there'll be multiple vaccines, and I have more optimism for certain vaccines than others, which we can discuss why. But I think we'll have several that will work, and then we're going to have to see what they do, because remember, we want the vaccine to do three things, and some vaccines may not do all three things. And those three things are: one, to reduce severity of illness and prevent you from going to the hospital or the ICU. Second, prevent infection with the virus. And third, if it does the latter, if enough people get vaccinated, it interrupts transmission. It may be that some of these vaccines don't produce high enough levels of virus neutralizing antibody or T-cell responses, so they'll be partially protective and therefore just reduce severity of illness, in which case we're still going to need contact tracing and social distancing and all the other things that we've been doing, but that's not being messaged either. So and there's a good likelihood, even though we'll have vaccines, they will not be replacement technologies. They'll be companion technologies with existing control measures. But again, the way the White House messages biomedical interventions, it has that magical quality to it that, whether it's hydroxychloroquine or remdesivir or now vaccines, it's a miracle and now we can all, have our lives back again. It's not so simple. As I often say, it's not 1956 when we brought all the journalists to University of Michigan headquarters to learn about the results of the big trials for the Salk vaccine, pull back the black curtain, then everybody went dancing in the streets. That's not going to happen. I can assure you that. It's going to be a gradual process, an iterative process. There's going to have to be a lot of discussion. Some of these vaccines will need additional boosters, who gets boosted, who doesn't, which population gets what. There's going to have to be an unprecedented.
Last question, when you heard about the AstraZeneca suspension of their trial and the transverse myelitis or whatever the neurological illness was, what do you think? Sort of an expected thing or maybe a showstopper? And how did you process that information?
Well, the way I process it, it's a 30,000 person study. If you have a city of 30,000 people, guess what? You probably have a case of transverse myelitis there or even multiple sclerosis. So that didn't bother me so much. But the messaging was disastrous because the way that communication was leaked, and then the fact that, the UK government said we're going to resume the trials because, we've reviewed it and we've deemed it safe, but they don't explain to anybody how they came to that conclusion.
So let's turn the mic over to you for a second. We'll bring Peter back a little bit later. So Jaime, would love you to talk a little bit about some of the international aspects of this. Peter got into a little bit of it, but issues of equity, issues of how we think about these issues, this as vaccines are being developed by multiple countries. They're going to be needed in multiple countries, some very wealthy, some not so much. So as a true expert in global health, how do you think this through?
Thank you, Bob, and glad to be here with my dear friends, Peter and Heidi. My topic today is on global vaccine allocation. Who goes first and why? So assuming, as Peter said, that we have one or more safe and effective vaccines by early next year, say, which ones should be distributed? By whom? To whom? And where? So there are different models for global vaccine allocation proposed by different agencies. We'll quickly review those models here and end up with some recommendations, if I might have the next slide. So what are the impediments for global vaccine allocation? I would list four: political, economical, supply and demand, and hesitancy. Vaccine nationalism, we have already seen examples that might lead to including banning exportation of vaccines. In terms of economical issues, who's going to pay for the vaccines? How much? On supply and demand, if we're aiming to vaccinate, say, 70% of the world population, close to 8 billion people, with 2 doses of vaccine, that's getting close to 11 billion vaccine doses. So imagine we need vials, we need syringes, we need cold chain, we need, of course, trained personnel to apply those vaccines. And Heidi will be talking about the skepticism around the vaccine, up to 30% of the people not wanting to be vaccinated now. Next slide, please. So Peter already talked about different countries producing different vaccines. On the right side of the screen, we have the vaccines produced in China, and this one produced in Russia. And on the left hand, we have those produced in the West. So the country of origin of manufacturing might have an influence in the geopolitics of distribution. Next slide. So in terms of nationalistic attitudes, we have seen already the White House attacks on WHO and multilaterals, and export controls have already taken place. In 2009, H1N1 vaccine was restricted for exportation. We have seen it more recently with remdesivir and with PCR tests. The attitudes from, frankly, racist attitude from the White House against shithole countries, the fact that billions of US dollars have already been allocated through advanced purchasing agreements with vaccine producers. So there's a real danger that vaccine nationalism will play a role. Next slide, please. There are two previous examples of allocation frameworks, one with H1N1 vaccine and then with the Ebola vaccine. In 2009, when finally H1N1 vaccine was produced, the priority population group was pregnant women, followed by contacts of kids less than 6 months of age, and then health workers. In the case of Ebola, the priority was about creating a ring, a firewall around isolated cases of Ebola. And then frontline workers, including funeral workers, became a priority. Next slide. So the National Academy of Medicine in the US is going to release a document later this month. And I am not allowed to comment more, except what is already public information. They are considering allocation principles like maximizing benefits, equal regard for lives, and not perpetuate health inequities, for instance. Next slide. And the National Academy is also prioritizing criteria based on risk of acquiring infection, risk of severe morbidity and mortality, societal impact, or risk of transmitting disease. Next slide. WHO is playing with two different models. One, model A, countries would receive doses in proportion to population size in the first phase. So let's say phase 1 would begin providing vaccines for 3% of the country's population. And subsequent doses would be provided until 20% of low and middle income countries are reached. Now, it has a problem, and we can discuss that later. The second model, countries would receive doses according to the number of frontline workers or the proportion of population over 65 years of age or the number of people with comorbidities. I don't like this model either because it penalizes countries that have very poor countries with few frontline workers or countries with a younger age pyramid. Next slide. Ezekiel Emanuel just published in Science recently with his colleagues a set of recommendations. He's placing a bonus on reducing premature deaths using a metric of years of life lost averted. And countries would receive doses according to their ability to reduce years of life lost per vaccine dose. He's also placing emphasis on reducing economic and social disruption using the same metric, and finally on reducing transmission rates. Next slide. Peter alluded to Gavi. I served as vice president of the board for years, and Gavi created with WHO and CEPI the COVAX platform for distribution of COVID-19 vaccines. And CEPI, which was created in Davos in 2017, is bringing the funding for research of COVID vaccines. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, most models emphasize allocating vaccines to prevent harm, prioritize people who have comorbidities or are vulnerable for whatever reason, and achieving equity. And one model is that given that the initial quantities of vaccine will be scarce, some groups should be prioritized. And it has been suggested that health workers should receive, say, the first half of vaccine batches, while one quarter should be distributed to people in high-risk occupations, food industry, or in nursing homes, and people with comorbidities. Final slide, next, please. So a few of my own recommendations: we should not compromise vaccine safety for political interest. I'm very worried with the White House approach. I also think that it is reasonable to have some level of nationalism and trying to protect your citizens first. I agree with that. But you should not retain more vaccine than is necessary to keep an R0 below 1. In my view, saving lives should precede saving the economy. We need to balance between saving lives and interrupting transmission. Different vaccines, as Peter said, might do different things. And finally, on November 2020, there's going to be a meeting of the G20. That is going to be our last chance, I think, to reach consensus on vaccine allocation and achieving global health equity with justice. I'll stop here, Bob.
Thank you, Jaime. And I think Peter's connection has re-hooked up, so we'll get back to him in a few minutes. But let me first bring on Heidi Larson to talk to us about the issue of vaccine hesitancy and vaccine confidence. It's been alluded to by both of our speakers, and this is what you have studied for a living. So maybe a little reflection on what you've heard and how you are thinking about the nature of this problem and how we're going to get ourselves out of this pickle. Welcome, Heidi. Thank you. So maybe take 7-ish minutes, 7-8 minutes, talk to us about how you think about when you hear about vaccine hesitancy. Peter brought up the autism example. And there's a long history here, which is now playing out in front of all of our eyes as it relates to COVID. So the floor is yours.
Sure, thanks so much. All important points here. We've been really, on the one hand, there was at the beginning when COVID was reported, I think there was this initial sense at least among a number of my colleagues and in the kind of global health community, felt like, aha, this is such a bad pandemic that finally maybe the anti-vaccine folks will change their mind. Well, it's kind of gone to the other extreme. The anti-vaccine sentiments and the dissent has actually been kind of joined up with a number of other areas that were not previously connected. So we've seen this dramatic amplification of the kind of antagonism towards vaccine, and it is woven in with the libertarian and the safety and the playing to the nationalism, playing to polarization. So that's the context, and that's not great news. On the other hand, we launched a paper in the Lancet last week, Global Trends in Vaccine Confidence. In 2015, we developed a vaccine confidence index. You're probably aware of it. And this is a paper of 5 years of the vaccine confidence run in 149 countries, over 250,000 respondents, looking at trends. Because there was a lot of, one of the reasons I founded the Vaccine Confidence Project, because I heard people saying, oh, it's getting much worse. And I myself saw these emerging trends. But you can't say worse if you don't have a baseline. So one of the key objectives of the Confidence Project was to get some metrics around this messy, emotional space that was actually starting to gnaw into the confidence fabric, the trust fabric of the social contract around vaccines. So we had this data, and the good news is that in the last 5 years, there actually has been a slight increase overall in public confidence in the importance, effectiveness, and safety of vaccines. Less so on safety, but more so in importance and effectiveness. Now, that's a global average. It's not against that kind of overall trend, high variability among countries. Some countries, particularly Afghanistan, Indonesia, there's a few others that have been in with other stresses on the system or vaccine-related events that triggered a problem. So some countries went up, some went down, but there is an overall trend. And I have to say, if one can even think of a possible silver lining with all the dissent and antagonism at the edges and going increasingly mainstream around vaccine, is that it's kind of been a wake-up call to the vaccine immunization community. And I mean, in the early 80s, when we moved, EPI and the first basic 6 vaccines to go global, and going from literally like 20% of the world to 80% of the world, that was a decade of so much investment in engagement and communication in that actually we somehow, when everybody seemed to be going with the program, as it were, we dropped the ball. Not totally, but didn't keep up with the engagement and communication, which, I mean, Peter talked a number of times about communication, and that's been a weak spot. And in the meanwhile, adding more and more and more vaccines. And we have a very different public now, particularly with the tools at hand, particularly with social media. It's been a combination of a kind of a growing rights agenda, more democratization, and tools to express yourself, and a lot of political issues coming up that have also created to polarization. So vaccines are highly in this mesh of issues, and we've been trying to, see how vaccines can build resilience. COVID is a huge opportunity. I think that we have had, it gives us an opportunity to build trust. I often say we don't really have a misinformation problem as much as we have a relationship problem. Misinformation's, in my view, a symptom, not the cause of what's going on. And I think if we don't build that trust, and it's a huge opportunity with COVID at multiple levels. How governments respond to COVID will either support or undermine the success of the COVID vaccine uptake. And when I say the response overall, I mean, we're following now our vaccine confidence project we've been internally calling it the confidence project because we're now looking across a multitude from masking and cooperation around masking, around distancing, around these other things that if we can't get cooperation around that, it'll be more challenging. I just got the data today, literally, on a 17, 18 country study on if a new COVID vaccine were available, I would take it. And in the spectrum of strongly agree to strongly disagree, across the countries we did, and it was trying to get a sampling across different parts of the world: Ethiopia, India, Saudi Arabia, South Korea, Nigeria, Brazil, Argentina, UK, Ecuador, Lebanon, Peru, Pakistan, India, Germany, USA, France, and DRC. I'm sorry, I have a slide here, but I want to stick to the program here. But overall, 41% on average strongly agree that they would take the vaccine. And when you disaggregate the tend to agree and strongly agree, tend to disagree, strongly disagree, and don't know, it's actually not as bad as some of the headlines are telling us. There are parts of countries that are subpopulations that are digging their heels in and have already decided, no way, we're not going there. But I think that we shouldn't get too discouraged I'm not saying we should dismiss the importance of engagement and communication, but I think it's not unreasonable for populations to have a certain amount of uncertainty. I saw there was one line in a recent article in the Christian Science Monitor on the COVID vaccine war and the title was "The COVID Vaccine War That Everyone Loses," for the same reasons that Peter had talked about before, in terms of, this has to be collaborative. But I also agree with Jaime that a certain amount of national prioritization is not unrealistic. It's just not overdoing it. But the article has this line that says, this is a story about the coronavirus, but not about the vaccine itself, and in parentheses, it doesn't exist, nor whether it will be efficacious, and in parentheses, we simply don't know. And I think we have to have some empathy with the population about the uncertainty, because frankly, the scientific community is although we have a lot more access, although not totally, to know whether we should have enough confidence, but it's a highly uncertain time. So I think that we need to have some empathy, and just that the act of saying we understand your concerns, rather than saying, you've got to get on board, no questions asked. That's where the breakdown happens. Now's the time we can say, you know what, we understand your concerns. As and when we start to get information, we're going to, we'll keep you in the loop. And now is the time to start that.
Thank you. Let's bring on the other speakers. I'm hoping Peter's connection is back on. Let me start with a couple of questions for you, Heidi. Thank you. Is there a diminution in confidence in other therapies? I guess we've seen this in masks, but are people more skeptical about antibiotics than they were? Are they more skeptical about heart medicines or cancer medicines? Or is there something unique about vaccines that makes the issue of confidence and skepticalness different for vaccines and other things?
Well, I think vaccines by nature are kind of, well, in the 1800s, the first vaccine confidence group, they said, well, it's against God's plan. It does inject, the nature of it does provoke some, and the fact that everyone takes it, the fact that the government mediates it, the fact that sometimes the government mandates it, that it's made by big business, that ultimately we're depending on big business. None of those things line up to make it warm and fuzzy if you've got any issues with big business, and especially in a context where we've been quite successful and people are not seeing the threat of some of these diseases. But there is a piece of good news in here on the vaccine front, and that we're just getting in some data. We've been doing routine vaccine confidence research with the European Commission over the last 5 years, and we're just getting in the data from 2020. And when we compared it to 2018, we saw that there was a 17% increase in public confidence in the flu vaccine. That's across 28 countries in the EU. So there's been this kind of curious knock-on effect where even though there's anxiety, and as I said, I think some of it reasonable around the COVID vaccine, people do get that, well, I don't usually get the flu vaccine, but this year I better get it.
Yeah. Yeah, I was wondering though, with all of those issues, and is there something unique about vaccines because you're getting it partly to protect others? If I'm taking an antihypertensive, if I'm taking a chemotherapy, it's really all about risks and benefits for the individual, whereas vaccines, some of it is that, and some of it is this sort of broader question of spread and sort of societal generosity. Does that play into the way people think about vaccines, or they really do frame it as risks and benefits for themselves?
Actually, I think as a scientific community, we look at risk and benefit because we always want to put the benefit part out there. But I think a lot of these parents and individuals look at risk. And frankly, they're probably more accurate with that, the risk of the disease, the risk of the vaccine.
Yeah.
Bring me back to your question.
Just a question whether vaccines are unique because part of the benefit is to others rather than you as the recipient.
Yeah, some of that's quite cultural. Like in Japan and in Asia, even wearing a mask is initially it's to protect others, even when you have a cold. I don't think it's a slightly different sentiment here, but we have seen in some of the research that the top reasons, we don't only ask about why people refuse vaccines, but why they take them. And the top two are protecting myself and protecting others. First, myself generally comes first, but the second one above other things is protecting others.
And maybe one last question for you, then I'll go to the others. What have you learned about the generation of trust in terms of, clearly the politicians have to get better at explaining this. Clearly the scientists need to be up front. But I assume there's sort of a world of influencers and rock stars and the person you follow on Instagram and all that stuff that's going to be potentially more persuasive to a 25-year-old about whether he or she takes a vaccine or wears a mask for that matter. Have we learned anything about who do you need to hear from to convince you to do this?
Yeah, and it really varies. One thing we've learned is never assume who it is. We need to find out, and that's one thing we do a lot on the social media analytics is who are the key influencers, who are the spreaders. But in some cases, it's not always the rock star or the scientist. Sometimes it's just, the local religious leader or the school teacher or I think what we've done is like we've either gone to try to get the politician to speak better or the scientist to kind of, talk in common terms. But I think we need to find this interim group that's kind of your neighbor, you're somebody who you interact with more at a day-to-day level, and get some of them to be helping with the translation on it. Because we underestimate sometimes in all the focus on bad social media, the influence of just day-to-day, when we used to have day-to-day interaction.
Right.
meeting people, bumping into people, sitting in the waiting room, wherever.
Yeah.
That discussion is there. So I think we need to work with local
I actually
publics.
hadn't thought about that, because if you think about it, yes, that might have been a mechanism before, and it's sort of been taken away from us now, and
Yeah,
it's yet another challenge. Let me turn to Jaime for a second. Jaime, you were outlining a distribution scheme, by the graybeards of the healthcare world and the National Academy of Medicine, and here's the scheme, and it's got point 1 and point 2. And yet we hear that, country A just bought up 10 billion doses, and country B just bought up, the entire supply from their manufacturer. How much of the allocation is going to be determined by WHO or Gavi coming up with a scheme that everybody follows? And how much of it is a land grab where countries are just sort of going to be looking out for themselves and just buying up everything they can buy?
I think that's an excellent point, Bob. And in fact, we have seen that rich countries, I'm talking about many countries in Europe and certainly the US, have already placed advanced purchase agreements worth billions of dollars with the main manufacturers to make sure their countries get the first batches. So that is the concern of COVAX and CEPI and WHO, that would get at least 10% of the production of the first batches. That was the agreement in 2009 when I was at the Gates Foundation for H1N1 vaccine. But that did not happen. So that is why I emphasize there needs to be a consensus of at the World Health Assembly. They made last May commitments to global allocation equity, but unless the producers actually allocate batches to WHO, Gavi, CEPI, COVAX, they will come at the end of the line. And CEPI and COVAX have already in place some multilateral advanced purchase agreements, some, but most have been by rich countries in bilateral agreements. So that is a real concern.
Yeah. Peter, are you, I guess you're back on. Good, welcome.
Yeah, well, it happened right after I started talking about Putin, so I'm pretty sure.
Something's going on. I don't know what's going on, but something. A lot of questions came up about the FDA, and I note that the head of the FDA lived in Houston with you for many years at MD Anderson. He was also co-chief resident with me at UCSF many, many years ago. He's a good guy. If you were to, maybe you know this, but what is Steve feeling now, and how confident are you that the FDA will resist the pressures they're feeling from Trump? I note the exchange yesterday between the CDC director and our president. Sort of, how do you think this is going to play out with the FDA over the next 6 weeks?
Yeah, I think it's going to be tough. The way the White House is set up, one of the interesting things about this is if you look at the modern history of the HHS agencies, CDC, FDA, and NIH, they've always managed to figure out a way to insulate themselves from White House incursions, right? This is not the first time the White House has tried to get into the business of one of the agencies. And the NIH has this probably fine-tuned to an art, in part because Francis Collins and Tony Fauci have been there for a long time. And not just them, their next tier down, has been there. So, when they know when something's coming, and they see the Jedi mind games, and they figure out a way to manage it and broker it, and they don't get phased when they get a call from 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. There's been an incursion in the other agencies like I haven't seen before. I don't quite understand what happened, but I think Steve Hahn came in right in the middle of this in a very, very tough time. And maybe some initial missteps around hydroxychloroquine EUA, but I think he's learned, and I think they're bracing themselves. I think there's enough pieces in place now to get ready for any attempt to what they call an October surprise. And the good news, I think tomorrow, maybe later today or tomorrow, the FDA is supposed to come out with a guidance document around how the emergency use authorization would work, with specifics, with what information will be provided. And I think that will help a lot. So I'm actually not that worried. I think the scientific community is strong enough to hold the line. I think our regulatory science and our systems are robust enough. So I'm a lot less worried than I might have been a few months or even a few weeks ago.
Hope you're right. Let me pitch that to Heidi. As you watch the American thing play out, and you see the sort of unprecedented amount of political incursion into the vaccine regulatory process, how does that strike you? What will that do to confidence and uptake? And I don't know if you're seeing analogies to it in other countries, but as you look at us, what do you think?
It's hard to find an analogy to the U.S. these days, but Brazil maybe? No. It's interesting. Yesterday I was reading through WHO and SAGE came up with their values framework for the allocation of vaccines. And I was going through the values framework and I was thinking, well, I mean, the US isn't looking at WHO stamped materials these days. But it was interesting, it was more generic and not specific like some of the other things coming out of the US on allocation. I would tend to agree with Peter. I mean, I'm living in the UK, which doesn't have a constitution. And I think that one thing that I regularly, and I won't even go into the issues here, but I do feel like for all the, not to say there aren't a lot of challenges, and I think there are a lot more checks and balances in the system. There are different ways to interfere. I do think one of the almost bigger serious problems is the toll it will take on the public's confidence. Because the public sees, even though some of us who are more familiar with backstage and have a little more confidence or know when to have it and when not to have it, I thought all the public sees is the tensions, the contradictions, the things not being clear, and it's already a hyper uncertain environment, and it's not helping. I do think where the strength will come is at a local level, local mayors, local situations, state level, and that's another place where the U.S. has assets in the size and in also the local state level. Confusing to the public, but I can only hope that we get through this and that when we finally do have a vaccine, we'll get it. We do have a bit, just not to ramble on, but there's one thing I think we really, in terms of the communication front, we really need to get the word out there. This is not the flu. This is an extremely serious illness. I mean, my husband's been through it, and 6 months later, and we're reading more and more about other people's long-term impacts. We are learning every day about COVID-19. And somehow, if people aren't motivated, we know the skull and crossbones, scary stuff does not work. Or is not productive. But I do think a better understanding of how serious this is and that you really don't want it is important.
I would just to reinforce something Heidi said, which is that, there is this vacuum left by Operation Warp Speed not communicating, and either it being filled by the pharma companies and they're being ineffective, or it's filled by the anti-vaccine lobby. But the other piece to this is the US now withdrawing out of the World Health Organization and out of COVAX is destabilizing the global governance of vaccines. I mean, we don't have, until now, I never really appreciated that US leadership was as important as it is. Because now with the COVAX mechanism, some of the Latin American country leaders are telling me, Peter, they're only guaranteeing 20% of Latin American countries will have access to COVID-19 vaccines, and they're still pretty expensive, and they want commitments without even knowing which vaccine they're going to get. So what you're seeing now are Latin American countries making one-off deals with the Russians, with the Chinese. It's a free-for-all out there.
Yeah.
And that's also causing an erosion in confidence in the whole global governance of vaccines. And that, took decades to build, and I'm worried about that.
Yeah, Jaime, maybe one last comment on that. I have one last question for Peter after that, and then we will quit. Go ahead, Jaime.
Just to follow up on that thought, it is really sad that the US has lost leadership and presence in global health by retiring from WHO, has not given any money to COVAX, not any money to CEPI. So it's losing a very critical leadership role. And that will come at the expense of geopolitics. China and Russia are very aggressively taking over leadership in Africa and in Latin America. And it's those upper middle income countries that will not benefit from free vaccine from WHO COVAX that will suffer the most, because they will not have access, or if they do, it will be at excessive prices. And that is where China and Russia are trying to fill a gap.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, it almost has like a Cold War feel to it, doesn't it?
Yes.
And that really worries me.
You have your Sputnik vaccine, right?
Yeah.
Peter, last question for you. I think one of the scarier things you said was, even if this goes great and we have a vaccine and it works and it's approved for all the right reasons, we don't get ourselves out of this pickle. And I think most of us have been assuming, and certainly you hear it all the time, okay, it's going to be summer 21, but that will be back to quote normal. So you don't think so?
Well, just to end on a somewhat optimistic note, there's no question a year from now, our world's going to be better. Our lives are going to be better. We will have vaccines. We will have a higher level of security. People will feel better about traveling on airplanes, and it will be much better than it is now. But I still, depending on how these vaccines work and the coverage levels, we are still going to need extensive public health control measures in place. And I think the American people are not being prepared for that. And that's got to be the message.
Not at all. All right. Well, thank you all for a terrific, interesting, partly optimistic, partly scary session. Hopefully we will get through this and get vaccines and get back to something resembling normal. It's been extraordinarily fascinating. I appreciate all of you taking the time to educate us today. Here's our crack production team. Let me give you a little preview of next week. We're going to talk about San Francisco, and San Francisco has had the best performance in COVID of any of the major cities in the United States. We've had fewer than 100 deaths in the city of San Francisco, which is by far the lowest per capita death rate. We will have some amazing people to help us think about that, including the mayor of our city, the Honorable London Breed, as well as our city health department leaders, Grant Colfax, Thomas Aragon, as well as Paul Volberding, George Rutherford, and Diane Havler from UCSF to help us think through the San Francisco experience and what we can learn from it. So with that, stay well, stay safe. I understand the air's a little clearer today. I'm out of town, and we will see you again next Thursday. Thanks so much.